Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar on forced transfers, which is being co-hosted by Dying with Dignity Canada and MAiDHouse. My name's Helen Long, and I'm the CEO of Dying with Dignity Canada. We're the national human rights charity that's committed to improving quality of dying, protecting end-of-life rights, and helping people across Canada to avoid unwanted suffering. We do that by ensuring access to quality of life, end-of-life choice and care through advocacy, education, and support. And I just want to note it's thanks to the generosity of people across Canada that we can provide this webinar and all of our services at no charge. Please note that a diversity statement has been posted in the chat for you, and you can feel free to review that. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Stan Byrne. Stan is a communication and marketing specialist in the legal field. She's a volunteer member of the MAiDHouse Communications Committee and a death doula.
Thank you so much, Helen. I need to do a land acknowledgement to start us off. We acknowledge as a virtual event, we span many traditional territories. Currently in Toronto, I am on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is also home to diverse First Nation and Métis people who continue to caretake this land. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. With any land acknowledgement, it's important to consider the ways in which you personally benefit from the land that you live on and what you can do to commit to giving back to the land that feeds and cares for you. Thank you for joining us today as we speak about forced MAiD transfers. While MAiD is legal in Canada, we still have significant pain points with institutions who object to MAiD because of religious or conscientious reasons. Tonight, we'll be speaking about what forced transfers are, the impact of forced transfers on patients and their supporters, and we're also going to be exploring the ethics around publicly funded institutions who refuse access to healthcare. This will be a powerful discussion and sometimes a very sad one, so I encourage everyone joining us to take care of themselves as they listen. Our chat is open for comments and discussion. We have scheduled a time for audience questions at the very end of the program, and I'm hoping that we get to everyone's questions. We always get some really great discussion going. Please add your questions into the Q&A box, which should be in the middle bottom of your screen. That way the questions go directly to me, and I will make sure that I can get to them and that we keep them anonymous. So without further ado, I am thrilled to announce our incredible panel. You have already heard from Helen Long. She is the CEO of Dying with Dignity Canada. She led Dying with Dignity Canada's efforts in supporting Bill C7 and continues to advocate for change to assisted dying laws. Dying with Dignity Canada hears regularly from people and their families who have experienced a forced transfer. Also here, I'd like to welcome Scott Harrison. Scott is an entrepreneur. He's a project manager, a consultant, and a former political advisor to the BC government. He has a passion for developing communities to create better outcomes for everyone. He has firsthand experience with forced transfers, having lost his life partner in November of 2021, and he would like to see this practice stopped. And finally, Tekla Hendrickson is the executive director of MAiDHouse, and she provides support to those who are using MAiDHouse and their circle of care on the day of their MAiD provision. Tekla also has firsthand experience as the witness of forced transfers and the many different impacts this experience can have. So welcome, Helen, Scott, and Tekla. So to begin, I wanted to frame the discussion first by outlining what forced transfers are. Obviously, people can choose to be transferred out of an institution if they would prefer to die at home or outside. Helen, can you tell us a bit about what we're speaking about when we speak about forced transfers?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So forced transfer basically occurs when a facility in which an individual is living or being cared for refuses to provide MAiD on site, and that patient is forced to transfer to another facility in order to either access the service or in some cases even to access the assessment. When a facility refuses to provide MAiD, we commonly refer to that as an institutional objection.
Okay. So I know that we're talking primarily about Ontario and BC here. So if a healthcare institution or a long-term care facility if they're publicly funded, what's the loophole that allows a institution to conscientiously object to MAiD?
Yeah, so I thought we'd talk BC because that's where Scott is based and that's where his experience happened, and Ontario because I think that's where we're based and probably many of the participants are. But the reason that forced transfers are allowed in some provinces or most provinces is different in every province. So in British Columbia, it's an agreement called the Denominational Master Agreement, and basically there's a group called the Denominational Health Association. It's made up of a number of religious or faith-based hospitals and care facilities. And through that master agreement, those institutions are not required to allow for MAiD. They're able to decide what services that they want to offer. MAiD is not one. Abortion is another one that they don't offer. And then as well, within the province, there's also, an access and care coordination policy as part of the province's health mandate that would support that fact. That allows anyone who is receiving less than 50% of public funding, so receiving public funding, but less than 50%, they are not required to provide MAiD on site either. So there's a couple of things in BC that are driving that. In Ontario, there's actually nothing that specifically allows facilities to refuse to provide MAiD, but there's also nothing that requires them to. And it's, basically the patient's first act would be the biggest piece of that, but it would require a directive from the ministry to actually force institutions in Ontario to provide MAiD, and that's not in place. And there's a whole, argument around whether that would or would not be successful if it was put into place.
Okay. And do we have an idea or any data on how many MAiD patients are being subjected to forced transfers?
Yeah, so we don't have any real data. There's been one or two papers done. The most recent was part of Vancouver Health Authority. It was done by a clinician, Ellen Weeb, that many of you may know, and a couple of other researchers working with Ellen. They reviewed all of the records from June of 2016 until June of 2019, so a total of, I think it was 442 MAiD cases. Of those, 9.5% were forced transfers. So, I think we could probably guess that in BC that number will be similar. In a province like Alberta, where there's such a high percentage of faith-based institutions, it's probably similar. But beyond that, most of what we have for data is anecdotal at this point.
And is this happening across Canada? Is there anywhere that it is not happening?
Well, it's generally not happening in Quebec.
Okay.
It's not happening in Nova Scotia or PEI. It doesn't seem to be happening in Newfoundland. That one's not quite as clear cut, but we're certainly not hearing from anyone in Newfoundland, but definitely within BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick. There are issues, and in each of those other provinces, there is some sort of agreement in place, which is somewhat similar to what's in place in British Columbia.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you, Helen. So Tekla, in your work at MAiDHouse, you have helped coordinate space for eligible patients who are forced to leave their long-term care facility or a publicly funded hospital. What's the impact emotionally and physically on these patients and also on their loved ones?
Thanks, Dan. I think it's important to look at it from two perspectives. So one, there is actually just the logistics of what needs to be organized. So it adds an extra layer. It is already sometimes quite complex and a long journey to get assessed and be eligible to MAiD. And now you're thinking about a transfer that you weren't necessarily planned on, In terms of the emotional impact, people often think of the person eligible for MAiD, but what I've seen and witnessed at MAiDHouse, it also has a huge impact on the people who are supporting them. And what that looks like in the difference is that for the person to having MAiD, it's often quite painful. You can imagine that they are being transferred from one bed to another kind of bed, going down the hall, bumpy bump, into an ambulance transfer or like a healthcare facility transfer, driving along the roads, depending on what your road conditions are. Then they need to be brought up to MAiDHouse and transferred into another chair. These are people who, are eligible for MAiD and often are suffering a variety of physical ailments, it is a painful physical journey for people. For those who are supporting them, it is often it was unexpected for all of them. They were shocked and surprised. Their person had requested MAiD, and there's all these extra steps. They sometimes feel stigma. They sometimes have experienced negative comments from the staff in the hospital, which again increases the feeling of shame. And sometimes they just feel like people have abandoned them. So someone has requested for MAiD, so therefore we don't need to give any more supports and services, and they're left alone to navigate this system. So I think there's a lot of those, you know, just the physical aspect, the pain, the additional logistics, and then, you know, what messaging is that given when you're in a certain place? For those who are long-term care, sometimes that has been their home and they're being asked to be moved from their home. So again, what messaging are you giving people when they're not allowed to stay in place?
Yeah, it's awful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Scott, you wrote about your partner's experience with a forced transfer right before her MAiD procedure. Can you start from the beginning and tell us a little bit about Christina and her admission to, it was St. Paul's in Vancouver?
Yep. Yeah. So St. Paul's, if I were to just point my camera up there, St. Paul's just up the hill from me. It's the close hospital downtown. It's been there for a long time. Unfortunately, it will be leaving. But St. Paul's was where she got our primary care. It's where she went the first week of August and was diagnosed. And it ended up, you know, she had a really, really horrible evening. We took her to the hospital and she was in palliative care probably within an hour of me dropping her at the hospital. So she was immediately in palliative care. The MAiD process for us, she had already requested MAiD. She went to go do her second round of chemo and she didn't want to do anymore. It just took away her quality of life. So she had already started that process and it was very efficient. It's just a simple 2-page form. We emailed it in. They contacted me in 40 minutes. They phoned her within an hour of receiving it, which was incredible. So we had the appointments and they're all set up. What was shocking to me is we were in palliative care in a publicly funded facility, in a publicly funded, world-renowned hospital, and we were being transferred for her to get a medical procedure. And it was a little shocking. So we were reassured that it would all be smooth and so on, but it was far from that. We were late to her death. There was her, you know, people she chose to be there when she died, they're waiting. You know, this is an incredibly difficult and traumatic time. And because of an arbitrary deal that was probably designed around abortion, this faith-based organization wants more pain, and that's what they delivered, unfortunately. So that's, you know, I'd like to be more sympathetic and say that they're doing a whole lot of good, but we were in a giant room with a view of the city. Like we could have had 15 people in that room. It was so big. And we went to an old 1950s building, you know, a 10, 12 to 15 minute drive away. And it had, you know, it was in the basement. It was like a 7-foot high ceiling. It was cobbled together and it was the doctor's residence. It was like we were committing a crime and we weren't. The crime was that somehow I can't have a private hospital, but the church can pick and choose what services they want to provide on the public dime. It's really not, it's not acceptable. It's one or the other. And there's been great fights out here about private healthcare and other things. And I just look at this organization that is refusing to provide women and dying people the dignity they deserve. It's very, very frustrating. And it was very painful for me to watch. And we're just trying to fulfill somebody's wishes. So yeah, that was my experience. It was very, very, very hard.
It's horrible. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Thank you.
I wanted to pick up on something that you said in the beginning of the conversation, just about,
Sure.
you know, when she was first admitted into the hospital. So when she was first admitted into the hospital, she was going for treatment. Is that correct? Like there wasn't a, and then she was, then she was put in palliative care.
No, she had something was desperately wrong overnight. Something had happened. I took her there because that's where she had always gone to the hospital whenever something was wrong.
Yeah.
And she went there, and they said, we'll take care of her. I got home, and within an hour I had a message from her. They had her, they were waiting to give her a room, a bed in palliative care. They wanted to give her a feeding tube, and she was like, no, that's not going to happen. So
Yeah.
either her stomach or colon lining had gone. So, I mean, it was just, they had the good drugs. They kept her alive. I don't know how she stayed alive. I'll be honest. I don't know how she stayed alive for those 7 days. It was a miracle of her own creation. Let's just put it that way. It was
It must have been,
period.
Yeah, excruciating.
It was.
I just wanted to ask a quick question to Tekla. Have you seen that where a patient is forcibly transferred after visiting their community hospital for treatment? So they go in, they expect something different, and then suddenly.
Yeah, I think the question is to that point is sometimes you're not choosing what hospital that you're going. So you are, you have a medical emergency, you're picked up in the ambulance, you go which hospital or emergency room has capacity on your journey. You find you're going to be put in inpatient. And then while you're there, you realize that you're terminal. And so you want to move forward with your wishes. And then you find you're not able to access MAiD on site. But it's not like you knew that hospital wouldn't, but you were in your journey, and then you get to one aspect of your healthcare and they say, well, no, not on site. So you can't plan for it, and it's this complication. And again, other people who were in, not necessarily because the ambulance dropped them off because of emergency, but they were in hospital, they were getting treatment, they were on their journey, many times thinking they were going to get better. And at some point, you get new information or treatments don't work, and then find out, okay, and now I'm looking at my other end of life care plan. And then they're in an institution that they didn't necessarily choose because it was faith-based or something like that. They chose because they were getting great healthcare at that moment in time and or where they had capacity. So, and it's unexpected, like families particularly are shocked that, they ask and then suddenly, no, they can't do that.
That, Tekla, just to pick up on it, that's the hardest part. I found one of the most painful. There's a lot of things around death and so on that people place their values upon you and your experience. That was one of the worst comments I ever heard from anybody was, why did you take her there if you knew? And I'm like, why? Like, how and why? You know what I mean? Like, I live in Canada. I thought everybody got this world-class care, or reasonable care at a hospital, and I had access to all of these. It wasn't like we were going for an abortion. Does that make sense? Like that's not what I'm thinking. So yeah, you go to the facility, you expect that you had a top tier hospital. What service would you not get there?
And I think Scott also kind of expressed, I'm trying to respect the wishes of Christine. I'm trying to do what the wishes are. So people are often on this journey going, I'm trying to get the best healthcare. What are their wishes? Then they get more information. Well, the person supporting is still trying to support those wishes. Like that is what they're trying to do. And then they get this big roadblock. And again, you're trying to navigate and how do I access MAiD? Not everyone knows how to do that. And, you're not getting the support in the facility necessarily. And there's extra layers and steps and extra people who have to be involved who aren't necessarily if it would happen in other places and spaces. But again, that barrier to people who are supporting, who are trying to respect those wishes, regardless of what they think of those wishes, like that's what their role and their caregiving is looking like at that time.
So Scott, you actually talked about this a bit in your article about the series of people that you went through on the day that Christina received MAiD. Can you talk us through a little bit about what had happened that day?
So what ended up happening that day was there's like a very badly written instructions for the hospital transfer people was to not be at the location where the MAiD was before 8:45. They interpreted that as don't come and get her in the hospital until 8:45. Well, we're 15 minutes away. Okay. So, I mean, badly, I will say it's not great English, but what was frustrating is when I went to go get some help from one of the, nurse aides or whoever it was, they refused to go downstairs. And I don't want to leave. And even they say, well, if you go downstairs, you might miss them. And, I'm like, well, that's like the biggest threat you could imagine. And the other thing that was strange was it was the only time a nurse didn't seem to be responsive or understanding what was going on. And they wanted to give Christina drugs. obviously a lot of pain, but she wanted to be conscious. She wanted to be aware and go into this with her eyes wide open. She wanted to be able to consent again, because she did actually get asked again if she wanted to die, right at the end. That's what the provider did. And the other more stressful or casual, brutal part when I got to senior legal counsel at Providence was that they didn't view that they made a mistake. They're like, well, you had to be transferred, so it's kind of like your fault. And I was like, well, it's kind of your fault, actually. I can't open a private hospital, but you can pick and choose. I don't understand. And they don't like that because they know you're onto them at that point. But the frustrating thing is that she had been on an IV when she got there, but she didn't need to be as many fluids. So they went to the portacath, which anybody who's had cancer patients, and they know the portacath, so you deliver chemo drugs. So they just switched to that because it's an easier thing, and it's already there. It's kind of built into you at that point. St. Paul's never informed VGH of that. And I knew on the email I was CC'd on in terms of the drug authorization that I didn't think to flag it. It almost meant that they were going to have to put in an IV. And now we're late, and they're scrambling trying to find the one plastic appliance that will connect so they can administer the drugs.
When you were
when we're actually at UBC, the doctor's residence are not UBC, at VGH at Vancouver General Hospital, at the doctor's residence, which is a big campus. And we're in the old building, and the two nurses are freaking out. So by the time I went to write a letter of, hey, I'm concerned, everybody involved in the process had already freaked out. Both the healthcare professional, like the two nurses and the provider, and everybody was really mad at Providence because Providence just didn't care. And that was the problem.
There was almost like no setup to make, even though there was this transfer, there wasn't even a way to make the transfer comfortable or.
Nobody wanted to make sure it was right. So their response was, we'll make sure we have a social worker there, because Christina chose to die on a Sunday morning. So maybe it was because it was a Sunday morning, but there was no social worker there. And I will tell you, the care that she got there for that week was outstanding, like excellent palliative care. You know what I mean? Excellent pain management. Excellent. World class, except the final thing. And the hardest thing, but so the most painful, if that makes sense.
And where did she end up receiving MAiD? Where did she get the MAiD?
It's called the doctor's residence. So it's a doctor's residence building at Vancouver General Hospital. So Vancouver General Hospital is a pretty giant campus. It's right near, BC Cancer. It's all right there. We have a lot of specialized facilities here for those. And obviously a lot of our treatment and other things were impacted between time of year, COVID. They actually fell out of their standard response times for BC Cancer at the time. There was a bunch of, I think, other things going on, but this is one little component that I double checked and quadruple checked, and it was supposed to be smooth, and it was not. And I didn't even get an apology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah.
And did the place that she ended up, like you mentioned I think you mentioned briefly when we were talking before, and also in your article, like she ended up in a basement?
Yeah, it's a basement of an old building that was probably built in the 40s or 50s on the Vancouver General Hospital campus. Like, there's newer and older buildings. I mean, at one point we had an empty building that we heated and guarded because we didn't fill it, for 15 years, but that's a different story of Vancouver. So that it's an old building there, and we just pulled up. I could not believe where it was. Like, I couldn't believe we were rolling into the basement of this thing, and that's where she was going to die. Yeah. And they had made it as nice as possible. Does that make sense? Like they found couches and to try and make it nicer than just an empty room in a basement.
And the people, and you were a little bit late for
we arrived after she was supposed to be dead. She was supposed to die at 9 o'clock. She died at like 12 minutes after 9. Like, it's really hard to explain how unbelievably stressful this is. First you've been watching your partner die slowly in front of you. And now you're psychologically ready for when they're going to die, and it's not happening on time because of this thing. It's just not right.
No.
So it just needs to stop. It's one or the other for me. It's either I get to open a hospital that I get to pick and choose what I want to do, or we stop having religious institutions deliver public services in Canada. I think they have a track record that's shown they don't deserve that right anymore.
The Tekla,
I
sorry.
was just going to add, I think that is where those extra layers, right? Like when you're being transferred, it takes extra time. So when you're at MAiDHouse, people often come early and have time to sit and be comfortable and do moments with the people that they've invited, and share words, share food. Whereas when you're being transferred from the hospital and just in the state that people often are, like you're transferred, you maybe get 15 minutes to kind of get settled, 20 minutes to get settled, and the pain management, making sure things haven't worn off if people are getting good pain management. And so you don't get that same kind of time, like Scott's talking about being late and that there were other people there. So where's that moment to settle together, right? And what those wishes were and things like that.
Tekla, so how do you think healthcare institutions can work with nonprofits like MAiDHouse to facilitate access to MAiD and improve those end-of-life choices for patients?
So ultimately, like Scott said, and I think Helen started at the beginning, is like people being able to have the healthcare that's legislative in the facility, so not having to move and have access to that healthcare that is part of what's available to us. If that's not possible in general, MAiDHouse, and I believe some of the institutions in BC do this, but I haven't had the experience where they designate a space which is kind of an area that's not part of their hospital but is part of our hospital, and they allow people to come in. So MAiDHouse could go in and be support in the facility, so that again you're not particularly transferring out of the facility. The other thing is when I'm working at staff at the hospital, for the majority, it doesn't always happen, but that the people who are coordinating the logistics on the hospital side are very, very attentive and very caring and make sure things are going smoothly. So if they keep doing that or enhance that access to social worker, we have heard some people feel like when they're in a hospital and they say they want MAiD, that their primary care team kind of walk away and say, okay, well, we're done, that's not us. But people aren't looking for that, for them to walk away. So if they keep doing the great care that they have, like that is not the end of the journey till it is over. I think that's also really, really important as well.
Yeah, so having that sort of point person that can coordinate those voices together.
Yeah. And I've worked with some really great ones. And like I said, we've also had experience and shared stories where a few people on staff said really horrible things to the people who were, being transferred. But for the people who are coordinating, that exemplary care and making sure and things are moving smoothly.
So Helen and Tekla mentioned this, and also Scott talked about it, a healthcare professional that seemed to maybe not explicitly, but maybe implicitly have a conscientious objection to MAiD. Are there protocols that healthcare professionals need to follow in terms of referral if they have a conscientious objection to MAiD, either in BC or Ontario?
Yeah, so, and just to be super clear, all clinicians do have the right to have a conscientious objection and not be involved in the actual MAiD procedure. And I think what we're talking about is the facility, not the individual. That said, they do also have a requirement to transfer your care. Now, again, this is different in every province. Ontario, because there was a court case in Ontario in 2019, we have a very strong, what's called an effective referral policy, which very clearly dictates what must be done and by whom, if you are choosing to object and you want to transfer care. In BC, they also have a transfer policy, but it's a little less stringent, let's say. It uses the word may. It's a little looser, but in theory, it suggests that your care should be transferred to someone else. And I think, it's important to remember, like when we talk about faith-based, they're generally faith-based institutions, although not always, but we're talking about publicly funded institutions. So, I think to Scott's point, if as taxpayers, we're paying for these hospitals to exist, we should be able to have the services we want. And I know Tekla noted there's a hospital in BC where they have a room that they pretend it's not part of the hospital, and but that's not really, in my mind, good enough. You literally shouldn't have to leave your bed, because that's your home, that's your community of care, that's where you should be able to access MAiD. And if you do have to be referred in terms of care from a clinician, that should be a seamless process where they connect you with the right person to get you set up again. Just because they don't want to provide the service themselves doesn't mean they don't have an obligation to support you in getting the care that you want.
Just to pick up on that, Helen, one of the things that I found interesting, and you talked about this, is that Providence Healthcare refused to design what they call a Switzerland room in a new hospital that's being built, which is the new St. Paul's. But what's interesting is down the road at a facility that's not listed in the master agreement you mentioned earlier, Helen, they do that. So isn't it interesting when they can enforce the rule because it's listed as a place, they do, but when they don't, they have to comply, and they are complying. And there's been cases in British Columbia of a hospice that was stripped of all of its money and assets because it refused to provide MAiD.
Yeah.
But they won't go after Providence that way. It's a very fascinating situation.
Yeah, and there's also, I won't name names just because I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but we also know that there have been occasions where an institution that doesn't allow MAiD on site will, for example, discharge a patient, and then an outside MAiD provider arrives to provide MAiD. So, I guess if you want to try and take a positive, the separate rooms, things like that, some people are attempting to try and be patient-centric and do the right thing, but ultimately the system needs to change. If we're funding the hospital, we need to be able to get the service on site. That's the short story.
And right now, Helen, do institutions have to be transparent about the services they provide?
Well, it's also an interesting question. It's funny. We used to have, some of you might recall the Shine a Light campaign that Dying with Dignity Canada ran in 2018, and that was us doing freedom of information requests to determine whether facilities allowed MAiD on site. And there was a court case not long after that basically shut that down and said, you don't have to tell them the answer. So we're now doing some work on that again, and it's totally voluntary. I do find that facilities are, at least in Ontario, slightly more open than they've been. I've been at a couple of palliative care conferences, for example, in the last little while, and people are much more interested in understanding, and while it may not personally align with them, they're thinking about the patient. So there is some room for that. But just to circle back to your question, yes, there are some facilities that are more open about what's going on. There's some requirements in different provinces where, for example, in BC, where we talked about if they're 50% funded or less, they don't have to provide MAiD. They do have to post, and they have to make that publicly known. But the rules are kind of all over the map. So if you, for example, thought, oh, let me just look it up on every facility in the country, no, you're not going to get the answers you're looking for. And, I think when Scott talked earlier about in Vancouver, for example, you don't always end up at the hospital that you would pick. There's also, Northern Ontario, there's several towns where there is only a faith-based hospital. In Alberta, Providence Health is so much of the healthcare there. Your odds of ending up in a faith-based institution are much greater. So there's all kinds of little barriers and situations that mean that you don't really know what's going on. And if you end up somewhere, and you're not thinking that you'll be dying at some point, the first question you ask isn't, well, if I need MAiD, are you going to let me have MAiD? Like,
yeah, obviously,
surprisingly, that's not top of mind when you start thinking about treatment for a condition. And, although this audience is well informed, a lot of people still don't even think about or know about MAiD until they're talking about their end of life options. So by the time they get to the conversation, if they're in the wrong place, it's really too late for them.
When people are in pain, they're not thinking about that. They're just thinking about, this is a problem right now. They're not like, what's the end game? But like that, it's not what you're going to the hospital for.
No.
right? Otherwise, you'd be at MAiDHouse, and you'd have a plan, and anyways, it's all frustrating.
No, that's a really astute point. Yeah. So I guess this is a question that sort of follows up from what you were talking about, Helen. And it was also brought up in an article by Dr. Sumner on the MAiDHouse website. Philosophically, is it possible for an institution to have a conscience? And what does that mean in terms of bodily autonomy? And what does it mean in terms of equitable access when we have a publicly funded institution that's making access decisions, but they're not obligated to the same sort of duty of care or referral that a clinician would have? How does that look? What does it mean?
Yeah, so Dr. Sumner is probably the best person to speak to that. But basically, the paper that he wrote talks about a case in 2015 at Loyola High School. And while it's not a direct comparison, I think it gives a bit of a flavor. And it kind of concludes that in order for an institution to be considered, to have conscience rights, it would have to be A, constituted primarily for religious purposes, and B, its operations have to accord with those religious purposes. So in the case of a hospital, I think you would have to say it was constituted primarily for healthcare purposes. So if you follow that kind of equation, then no, I don't think a hospital could qualify as having conscience rights as an institution. And, I think there has never been a case that specifically speaks to this, but I think we could definitely say that a healthcare institution was formed for healthcare purposes, not religious purposes. And as such, it doesn't have conscience rights.
Hmm. And what type of, because of this, what type of advocacy do you think we can do? The people listening, the people hearing about this, the people here on this panel, I mean, who are already doing so much advocacy, I know, but what are some things that we can do to educate people about forced transfers, to stop the practice from happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's always the official political routes and the behind the scenes routes, and there's a variety of things that can be done. The people on the call, the most important thing they can do is to talk to their elected officials. Tell their friends and have them do the same thing, but let the people you vote for know that this isn't okay with you and you don't support it. Write a letter to the premier of your province. Try to set up a meeting with your local MPP. And talk about it. Because this is a provincial issue, it's different in every province and it's going to take work in every province. We're really focused right now on BC. We're doing a lot of background work in Ontario and Alberta in the hopes of launching bigger campaigns there. But, as voting individuals, the best thing you can do is talk to the people that represent you.
And Scott, you talked a little bit about some of the advocacy that you're doing. Did you want to talk a little bit about the things?
Sure. Really, I'm just doing what Helen's doing. I'm just adding voices. I'm informing people that, maybe the healthcare system's not as transparent as you think it is. Maybe it's just not there. Maybe we need to ask ourselves harder questions. I have debated about, starting a charity or nonprofit to eliminate this practice, that we need to get either, we need to have just fully public facilities or not. And we can't have these quasi in between rules that are shaped by, archdiocese 3 layers in the background. We need to just get away from that. And I think it's part of a broader conversation in Canadian society. And I think we should have that. But I think we try to avoid hard conversations in general because we don't think people can handle it. We don't think that people are smart enough. And maybe, everybody experiences death. We just don't talk about it. And maybe we just need to have a little more conversations about that and a little more faith in that process. But I do think it's time the behavior and the action stopped. And I don't know what the ultimate advocacy will. If there's people on this watching this that are like, hey, Scott, let's get together and start doing this. I'm interested. Let's put it that way. It'd be fun to see some of these large institutions that think they're untouchable, have a mirror put up to them and see what their actions really are.
And Tekla, did you want to add anything to that in terms of advocacy or things that people can do?
No, I support what's being saying in terms of the work that Dying with Dignity Canada, they've taken a leadership role, and Scott talking about dialogue and discussion and shining light so that people are aware, and really being aware of the personal impact on people and their end of life experience. But as Scott so vividly shared, on the impact of the people who are supporting, who carry on with those stories, and the impact that it has had on their lives, and the experience of supporting someone who is dying, and how that shaped that experience, and the, you know, the grief and bereavement after that, I think is really important. It's not a non-impact decision. You know, it is an equal care. It's not enhanced. MAiDHouse, I think we offer a really great service when we're involved in transfers of care. I don't think that's the optimum use of our service.
I think what those kinds of places are fantastic, and if you can plan, you know, thanks to Hospice Society, I have a, you know, bereavement walking support group I'm with, and you hear the stories, and I can tell you right now, most people losing partners these days from terminal illness, it's MAiD. You know, it's over 10% of deaths on Vancouver Island because of the number of seniors. It's MAiD. Like, this is a huge issue about how you get to end your life, and whether it's going to be in pain or less pain. And that's what we're talking about. And anybody who has a loved one that they've sit and slowly watched them die in front of them, they're going to choose this. I don't know anyone who wants their loved one to live in pain when they're going to die anyways. It's really an important conversation. So I was very proud to be part of this. So thanks for the invitation.
No, I'm so glad that you were here. Thank you so much for sharing your story. So in the spirit of that and that conversation, my last question for all of the panelists and for any of the audience members who want to add it into the chat, what constitutes a good death? What do you think would mean? What does that mean for you personally?
Okay, I'll go first.
Yeah, you go first. Yeah. I was going to pick on you anyway, but yeah.
Okay. It's the death you choose. You know, if someone wants to have palliative care and die that way, if someone wants to die at home fighting till the bitter end, if someone wants to have MAiD, it's whatever you decide a good death looks like. So, you know, when we talk about forced transfers and the elimination of forced transfers, it's so that people who choose that death in the hospital or in the care facility, they're able to do so.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I mean, it's a really personal decision, and it's about having those conversations in the way and being able to think about it, to actually start thinking about what that would look like and what that means to you. And then as you decide that, you have the supports and services that help you reach that aim, if that, you know, if you're at that stage. So, but I think Scott talked about, you know, just not even being aware what your options are. So being aware and educated and know what some of the things to think about. I mean, Dying with Dignity Canada has some great advanced care planning tools, which I think would probably be really supportive of, you know, planning what your good death might look like, or what you need to do, both on the logistics side, but the emotional side. So I think engaging those conversations.
Yeah, that's a great point, because Dying with Dignity Canada has some amazing resources in terms of advanced planning. It's really useful. I've actually used them myself and have found them to be like very helpful in talking to my family about them. But Scott, I also wanted to hear from you.
For me, what, you know, a good death, it's one with dignity. I mean, it's a dying with dignity. It's just having the opportunity to end it on your terms, that you're going to die. You're in a tremendous amount of agony and pain. You know, I had to listen to intern cancer doctor trying to convince Christina that MAiD really wasn't the right thing. And it was really hard to watch. And I just would like to see that definition of life be different. There's a difference between breathing and having a life. And same with death. It's going to happen, and you have to be ready for it. You have to be ready for that thing. And as you know, some people want to fight. They don't want it. They're going to fight. I've heard of other people that qualify for MAiD, but their partner's like, no, but let's get past Easter and let's get past this event, and then you can go. And that's not really, you know, that's that's about that person doesn't want to lose their partner, or they don't want to lose their whoever that person is. And it's really hard. So for me, it's personal. And for me to have the right to die with some dignity doesn't take away somebody else's values. It doesn't take away that values. It doesn't, if your belief system says MAiD is not for me, great. You know what else might not be for you is, like, I don't know, certain types of surgery, right? Like maybe dyeing your hair is not, like, nobody's forcing you to accept this. It's just, you have an option to it. And I think that's, I guess I'm getting a little off topic, but yeah.
No, you're not. The choice is,
it's just the
fundamental,
choice is yours, and that's the important part to me. I think that the choice, it's important you have the choice. And I think that it's horrible that you go to somewhere to get the care, and it is one of the choices you have, and then these institutions are taking that choice from you. And it's like the biggest, can you think of a bigger choice? And then they take it away from you by forcing you. And I can't even imagine how painful it is. I mean, Tekla has explained well how much pain people are in. And I remember Christina's, vividly, that drive, every bump on the road was agony for her. Like, she was in agony and we had to drive. It just blows my mind. We had a giant room. We had a giant room in palliative care at a publicly funded hospital, and we had to leave to go to another publicly funded hospital. Just seems insane to me.
Yeah, no, you're right. Thank you, everybody. So now we have a little bit of time for questions. So just bear with me as I open up the Q&A box here. Okay. So the first one is, most of our progress with MAiD has come about through actions in the courts. And what would be involved to get a court decision outlying forced transfers?
Okay, well, not being a lawyer, I'm going to preface it with that, but we believe that, we would need someone who was experiencing a forced transfer to be part of a case like that. And the challenge, obviously, is that often by the time we're talking to people, they're at the very end of their life and they're in the transfer situation. So I think that's been the biggest barrier to a court case, is the fact that unlike the Truchon decision or the Carter decision, those individuals weren't imminently dying. Kay Carter did die, but her daughter was able to continue the suit at that point. So I think for forced transfers, it's really getting someone who, for whatever reason, is in care longer, and perhaps is thinking about MAiD, and then is involved at the point that they're told they have to do a forced transfer. So I think a timing challenge more than anything. Could there be a case around, for example, Dr. Sumner's article and those thoughts that institutions can't claim conscious objection? Potentially there could be. Our experience in lawsuits is generally as an intervener, so I don't have a lot of direct experience, but perhaps that is an avenue that could be explored by the right pro bono lawyer who wants to call us up.
Who's listening today, who
right.
magically
friend of a friend, we're not fussy.
Okay. This is maybe a question from the audience, and maybe Tekla is a good person to answer this. Can we use other facilities for MAiD? Does everything have to be in hospital? And kind of a follow-up question to that from somebody else is, can you die at home using MAiD?
Yeah, so you can definitely die at home using MAiD or any other location that you're interested in. Just some people choose, for a variety of reasons, that they don't want to die at home, that's not a place that they would choose to have their MAiD, often because they have beliefs around their loved one and how difficult that would be, or their place in space doesn't feel like a safe place for them to do that. So you absolutely could do home or another location. So it doesn't have to. And then some people, other hospitals, but some people don't even want to be in an institution period when it comes to that point. So, and MAiDHouse then of course is another alternative. And, we're hoping to open more across Canada as we're able to.
Okay, great. I think I had read somewhere that somebody had received MAiD on their yacht, which sounds great, if you have one. So this question is for Helen. Are there lists of hospitals by locale that do and do not perform MAiD services? I know we talked about this a little, where people have a choice or time. It would be maybe helpful to know that.
Yeah, and no, there's not anything I'm aware of. I mean, there's probably internally we have more of a list of the places that don't allow it. But even as we're, I mentioned in Ontario, for example, the freedom of information, you can't, they're not forced to respond anymore. So even as we're surveying in Ontario, there are institutions answering our questions, but ensuring that we're not going to publicly share that information before they give us a response. So no, there isn't. Our hope is at some point to be able to kind of reignite the Shine a Light campaign and to show where the MAiD friendly facilities are, but there's nothing at this point.
Okay, thank you. So for, I'm just reading through this question here, just making sure that it. For those residing in faith-based facilities, the vast majority accept the principles related to MAiD and would very much likely request MAiD. Let's see. The conflict, so I'm just trying to read through just to make sure that's a question. Okay, no, it's not quite a question here. I think that's probably all we have time to answer tonight, just as I'm looking through. I wanted to make sure that we honor everyone's time commitments. Thank you to our audience for listening and for your thoughtful questions and comments. Thank you so much to the panelists, Tekla. Thank you to Helen. A particular big bow of gratitude to you, Scott, for sharing Christina's story with us here tonight. And I definitely, listening to your talk about her, it really moved me and touched me. So thank you so much for that. And thank you also for your incredible advocacy. I'm going to pass it back to Tekla to talk a little bit about MAiDHouse. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Stan, again for moderating and facilitating these conversations. MAiDHouse, Dying with Dignity, and the people who join us on these panels are very committed to conversations and dialogue to explore these issues and have different perspectives comes together to, as Scott said, have these really hard conversations and see what we learn and what we share from them. So thank you for everyone and participating. MAiDHouse, as we talked about during the event, is a place that people can go if they're eligible for MAiD to have their provision, as long as they have their MAiD provider. We are extremely grateful to the supporters who support both Dying with Dignity and MAiDHouse, who allow us to do these virtual events and these education and conversations and offer them for free. So we appreciate that. There will be a poll popping up very shortly. If you could please provide your feedback, that is very helpful so that we can use that to guide our future events. So please sign up for Dying with Dignity's newsletter and MAiDHouse newsletter so you can keep up to date of the other virtual events that we will be hosting and the other activities. And again, Scott, thank you so much for coming and being part of the panel. Thank you, everyone.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. And anybody who wants to contact me, my email is real easy. It's scott@scottharrison.ca. It's not hard to find me. I noticed some questions people wanted to reach out. So.
Thank you so much, Scott.